We want to work towards a harmonized understanding of teachers and teaching in refugee hosting settings. So a key outcome of this meeting is going to be a memo of recommendations produced by INEE, UNHCR, and Education International members and submitted to Unesco's International Task Force for Teachers 2030. And we hope that these recommendations can be included in the Transforming Education Summit in September. My name is Chris Henderson. I am the co-chair of the Teachers in Crisis Context Collaborative with the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. And it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce to you some of our speakers, our panelists for today. But appropriately, I first want to introduce the two teachers who are joining us today. So first off, we have Ms. Lilian Tumultuos Johanna, who is a 26-year-old Sudanese refugee residing in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. So Lilian, if you could give us a quick hello, that would be amazing. Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. So Lilian, if you could give us a quick hello, that would be amazing.
Thanks for the chance. My name is Lilian Tumultuos Johanna. I'm joining in from Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, and I'm a refugee from Sudan and a teacher in one of the refugee schools that's in Kakuma refugee camp. Thank you.
Wonderful, Lilian. It's amazing to have you here today. Thank you for making the time. And we also have Mr. Abba Babo, who is a 34-year-old Central African refugee residing in Chad since 2014. Mr. Babo holds a degree in veterinary engineering and is pursuing a master's degree in animal production at the moment. Mr. Babo, thank you for being with us today.
Bonjour, c'est Monsieur Abba Babo. Je suis réfugié et enseignant exilé au Tchad depuis 2014.
Also with us today, we have the Honourable Minister of Education from Chad, Mr. Mohamed Said Farah. Welcome.
Bien, merci. Bonjour, je m'appelle Mohamed Said Farah, secrétaire général du ministère de l'Éducation nationale et de la promotion civique du Tchad. Merci.
To my right, to your left, from UNHCR, we also have Charlotte Bequin, who is with the Regional Bureau for West and Central Africa. And we also have Mr. Mohamed Hure, who is with the Education Sector section with UNHCR in Copenhagen. We also have Ms. Adriana Elizabeth, who will be our moderator today from Mexico. We also have the Director of the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, Mr. Dean Brooks. We also have the Director for Research, Policy and Advocacy from International Education International, my apologies, Ms. Antonia Wolf, welcome. And sorry, Carlos, we've got you down the end, but we have Mr. Carlos Vargas Tamez, who is Unesco's Chief of Section for Teacher Development and Head of the Secretariat for the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030. Just briefly, I'll give you an overview of the way we'll run today's meeting, and then I'll hand over to Adriana to moderate on our behalf. So we've got three provocations that we want to introduce today, and we'll address those provocations after our colleague, Mr. Farah, presents some information on the experience of refugee teachers in Chad. For each of the provocations, we've invited one of our panelists to provide the first reflection. After that reflection, we'll give you an opportunity from the floor to also feed into that provocation, and particularly how we reconceptualize, how we transform, how we consider the work of refugee teachers in refugee hosting settings. But first and foremost, and importantly, over to you, Mr. Farah. Merci.
Bien, merci beaucoup. Je m'appelle Mohamed Said Farah, comme je l'ai dit. Je viens du Tchad, un pays de 1 284 000 km², un pays bordé par la Libye, le Soudan, le Niger, le Nigeria, le Cameroun et la RCA, mais un pays qui reçoit beaucoup de réfugiés en provenance de la RCA, qui donc vont dans les régions du Logone oriental, du Mandoul, du Moyen Chari, du Logone occidental, des réfugiés venant du Soudan qui vont dans les régions de Sila, du Wadi Fira et du Wadaï, des réfugiés venant du Cameroun, du Niger, du Nigeria, qui vont dans les régions du lac. Donc, nous avons suffisamment de réfugiés dans notre pays et qui sont les bienvenus chez nous et que nous recevons avec beaucoup de plaisir parce que le Tchad a connu également la guerre à un certain temps et donc nous sommes également en droit de répondre favorablement à ces frères qui viennent trouver refuge chez nous et auxquels nous souhaitons un bon séjour, mais auxquels nous souhaitons également que la paix s'installe chez eux pour qu'ils aient l'occasion de repartir un moment venu. Donc, en mai 2014, notre pays a inscrit dans son programme, n'est-ce pas, l'intégration des écoles des camps de réfugiés dans les curricula tchadiens. Ça veut dire que tous les réfugiés qui sont chez nous étudient dans nos écoles gratuitement, mais également selon notre curricula. Donc, ils n'ont aucun problème. Ils ont intégré normalement les curricula et donc ils sont enseignés par nos enseignants, mais aussi les enseignants des réfugiés, les anciens réfugiés qui sont venus se réfugier chez nous peuvent également trouver de la place. L'exemple de mon ami Babo que je salue, Charles également, Diamena que je salue, Elisabeth Coco que je salue très chaleureusement. N'est-ce pas? L'exemple, il est là, il est clair. Monsieur Babo a trouvé de la place et aujourd'hui, il est devenu un enseignant comme les autres enseignants du Tchad. Parce qu'effectivement, le curricula convient également au travail qu'il réalise. Comme vous le savez, nous avons reçu il n'y a pas longtemps des réfugiés camerounais qui sont venus de la ville frontalière de Kousseri. Aujourd'hui, les réfugiés camerounais sont dans le département du Chari, également dans une partie de la ville de N'Djamena. Ils sont reçus, intégrés, ils sont dans nos écoles comme si ils sont chez eux. Donc, le Tchad vraiment est très fier de recevoir ces réfugiés-là qui se sentent chez eux et dont les enfants ont la possibilité d'étudier dans notre curricula, dans nos curriculas, et qui aujourd'hui n'ont aucun problème. Si demain, ils repartent chez eux, ils vont repartir avec les diplômes tchadiens. Et en quittant le Tchad, les réfugiés sont admis dans nos lycées pour passer le baccalauréat et souvent ils réussissent donc à nos examens du baccalauréat. Et je leur souhaite donc très bonne réussite. Et je souhaite surtout aux enseignants réfugiés qui travaillent chez nous de le faire avec beaucoup de volonté. Ils ont en face d'eux des enfants qui sont de leur pays, mais également des enfants tchadiens. Donc, notre exemple est un exemple qui a été loué. Aujourd'hui, le Tchad est cité comme étant un pays d'accueil qui intègre facilement les réfugiés, mais également qui les intègre dans nos écoles et formés grâce à nos curricula. Merci.
J'allais dire, on va faire une pause pour la traduction. Merci. I'm going to give a very brief translation for those of you who don't speak French. The Secretary General of the Ministry of Education, the microphone. Sorry. So the Secretary General was saying that Chad is a country that itself has been at war, and as a consequence, it welcomes refugees into their schools and as teachers. Since 2014, that has been a policy, the integration of refugee learners into national systems and the acceptance of refugee teachers into the national teaching workforce. They have refugees from Sudan, Cameroon, Niger, Nigeria, Central Africa, and they welcome them with open arms. And the children finish their studies, their primary studies, and they are eligible to go on to their secondary studies. And when they leave Chad to go home eventually, they carry with them a Chadian diploma.
Merci beaucoup, Secretary General Farrar. Just next, briefly, I'll pass to my colleague, Mohammed Huru, who will give us a brief scene setting of refugee teachers in crisis context.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for joining us today. I think you might have seen a recent report by UNHCR, which indicates that global displacement is now at all-time high and has, reached 100 million. Many of those that are displaced are school children who have been forced not only to leave their home, but also abandon their schools and studies. Education transformation will not take place if the needs of these displaced children and their teachers is not met. Our meeting here today focuses on the transformation of our understanding of teachers and teaching in displacement context. We are bringing the voices of refugee teachers. I think you have seen them being introduced to this meeting and to this discussion. And I hope it will inspire all of us to act and to do more for them, the teachers, and the children who often are invisible and do not have a voice. Refugee teachers particularly are incredibly motivated, resilient, and they want to, support their communities, but they often face daunting challenges. They are not included in national teacher management and development systems, which means they are not part of the national plans, budgets, and programs, and they cannot bring their voice into that. And you can imagine, if you are not part of the national plans, national budgets, national programs, you are essentially invisible. And so how do we remove this invisibility? How do we bring them to the table? I think this is something we need to think about, but also act on it. And the Transformation Education Summit and the what has been, the work that has been going on in the last few days here presents us an opportunity. And despite the essential role they play, some of the challenges they face, I've mentioned, their non-inclusion in national systems, but a lot of them who have been teachers in their countries of origin, when they are in the countries of asylum, their prior qualifications is not recognized. So you can imagine being a professional and all of a sudden crossing a border and you have no recognition of what you have worked maybe so hard for years and you're passionate about. They often face situations of, low compensation or remuneration. I've worked in the Kakuma refugee camp for many years. A teacher makes for a month $60 to $70. But you look at this level of compensation vis-a-vis the working environment. Class sizes are, have over 100 children. In some instances, I've seen classes that are 100, 120, 150. And this is, on average. So you have that low level of compensation and you're working in extremely difficult and complex classroom environment. And when you have, such a level of overcrowding, it's not only, the class size that is large, but it also means, when you have overcrowding, congestion, it implies that every other thing is inadequate. The number, the desks, the textbooks that children have access to, the teaching materials that you need. So you have, it's extremely difficult. I was a teacher myself in a refugee camp, and I loved my job, but I also often agonized when it was time to mark scripts for so many, children. It was a nightmare. How do you mark 600, 700 scripts, and prepare the mark list and submit it, and provide the report form to every child. So you can really imagine, how difficult it is. I've seen, if I speak to the lack of recognition, sometimes not only of the prior qualifications, but you're a teacher, you come into exile and you stay in exile for decades. So you retire, basically, but with no recognition, with no pension, with really nothing. So we really need to think about all those dynamics. And I think I will say, if we do not provide sufficient support, recognition for refugee teachers, then education access will remain precarious for refugee children, and generally, children in crisis and displacement context. And we will not also be able to achieve SDG 4. So it's therefore very important that we, do all that we can to support refugee teachers, to take the steps that is needed to make them, professionals that are recognized, and importantly, to provide better and predictable support so that we can transform education for the children whose futures is in jeopardy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jure, for the great information for us to have the bigger picture. Hello, everyone. My name is Adriana Figueredo. I will be your moderator today. I'm part of the DAFI program in Latin America, as well as the Tertiary Refugee Student Network, a regional leader for Latin America region. I'm so glad to welcome you all to today's session, where we will be talking about the Thematic Action Track 3, Teachers, Teaching, and the Teaching Profession. Now we're moving through 3 fundamental issues to provoke our conversation. For each question, we will hear from our panelists, from our teachers, and from our audience as well. We really want to make sure this session is participatory, so please engage. We are also really excited to hear directly from our teachers as well, although they are not here physically. We wanted to make sure their voices and issues are also included. So the first question, who do we consider to be teachers in refugee hosting settings? Might new definitions and preconditions for entry into the profession address the global teacher shortage? Let's start by hearing from our teachers as that they are joining online.
My name is William from Sudan. I became a teacher because I was easily inspired by one of my high school teachers. The challenges that I went through before becoming a teacher, that is most especially when I was in school. Now you find that when I was in school, the school was far away from where I lived. So for me to work up very early in the morning and reach the school was very challenging because it was also risky. Then the other challenge also was lack of learning materials. The textbook was insufficient, there were very few, and the learners were many. So it was challenging and it was very difficult for us to study. And also the other challenge was high population. The process was congested, and we had new teachers. Now you find that we can go the whole day, or we can miss some of the lessons during the week, which was really challenging. After my high school, I was looking for a job, particularly for being a teacher. The number of the refugee teachers seeking for employment was very high, but I tried my best. I was selected for an interview. I went for an interview and I was also selected as one of the private school teachers.
Je m'appelle Apapado, je suis réfugié sénégalais, exilé au Tchad depuis 2014. Avant de devenir enseignant, j'ai commencé d'abord à faire l'enseignement à domicile, à l'issue desquels j'ai qui m'a permis de laisser des journées pour avoir des licence. Après avoir fini une licence, j'ai commencé à déposer dans les établissements privés pour enseigner comme enseignant académique, sciences de la vie et de l'emploi. J'ai été évolué dans les établissements, à travers les établissements, le contexte scolaire et également le contexte scolaire où j'ai fait des manifestations comme enseignant académique, en sciences de la vie et de l'emploi. Au début, ce n'était pas facile parce que pour entrer dans les disciplines, c'était difficile pour avoir des enseignants qualifiés, pour avoir des niveaux de formation pour pouvoir enseigner dans les classes. Et pour faire déposer le dossier, vous êtes obligé à passer des tests de recrutement. À l'issue des tests retenus, vous êtes signé maintenant un contrat avec l'établissement pour avoir l'accès à l'enseignement. Et c'était comme ça. J'ai passé quelques procédures et finalement j'ai commencé à faire une conversation.
Now it's time for the intervention of our panelist, Antonia Wolf from Education International. Over to you.
Thanks so much, and hello, everyone. So Education International is the global organization of teachers, representing about 32 million teachers across the globe. And our starting point is, of course, that teaching is a profession. It's rooted in professional standards, in professional ethics. And if we're serious about ensuring equity and quality and inclusion in education, then we cannot start messing around with the training and qualifications. We are, I think, collectively, globally today, working towards more training, more qualifications, exactly to ensure that teachers are supported in their work. And there is something very, very challenging in the notion of compromising on this in settings where many of the children would need more support than many other students. So that's our starting point. And then, of course, when you're dealing with crisis situations, the context is very, very different. Yet we know crises are increasingly protracted. So we do want to look for something that is sustainable in the long term. So a couple of thoughts from our side, starting with the fact that very many refugees are teachers. They are qualified teachers. Many love teaching. They want to continue teaching. So then it's really a question of how do we put a framework in place that allows them to continue teaching and being supported as they do so. A first thing would be around the refugee registration processes and how we can map certain key professionals. Another thing would be a path towards accreditation. How can we recognize the qualifications that refugee teachers have, the experiences that they bring with them from their country of origin? How can we make sure that there's additional training, that there is continuous professional development? And how can we support the learning of whatever the local language of instruction may be? We had a wonderful example from 2015 where in Sweden, our member organization Lärarförbundet was working with the government and a number of other partners to identify a process that would be faster than the existing teacher training in Sweden, but wouldn't compromise on the quality. And they identified a process of 3 stages to allow for refugee teachers to as fast as possible, be able to teach in Sweden as qualified teachers. And I think this is a really good example of education unions being strategic and important partners in this conversation as well. And here I think you see really the union as a resource, bringing in almost a community of practice, the professional community, opening up opportunities for different forms of mentoring, peer support, different forms of teacher collaboration, which I think is so important when you sit there with those 600 papers. Could we make sure that there is a collective around you, so something that helps you keep that energy going as well? And then the second piece, of course, unions, issues related to the rights and the working conditions of refugee teachers. So we know that many will be working in difficult contexts where providers are diverse, which also means that the conditions that teachers work under will be different. And here I wanted to mention an example from our Ugandan member organization, UNATU, who's been working with partners, including the UNHCR in northern Uganda, to make sure that refugee teachers enjoy the same level of rights and conditions, regardless of who they formally work for. And I guess my last point is really about refugee teachers as a resource also in that immediate response. So really finding ways of benefiting from the fact that you have qualified and committed individuals who can really help ensure that learning continues, individuals who speak the language of the country of origin, and really, I guess, going back to that question of how do we put that framework of support around these refugee teachers, knowing that many of them will also have gone through a very, very difficult time. So that's what I'll leave you with. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Antonia, and thank you for also mentioning the documentation and lack for accreditation and qualification for teachers, because we know it's a big challenge for them. Now we would like to hear from the audience. We would like to have questions or comments. Please be specific and direct to the point so we can hear from many people. These comments are in relation to the same question, but let me repeat it again. Who do we consider to be teachers in refugee hosting settings? Might new definitions and preconditions for entry into the profession address the global teacher shortage? Is there anyone in the audience who would like to ask something or have a comment?
Thank you so much. I have mostly a question. I wanted to know what are the successful examples of refugee teachers teaching either in their own curriculum or the curriculum of the host country? Because depending on what curriculum and what types of textbooks we use, both the issue of qualification and the language can be seen as temporary or long-term. If in temporary situations, teachers can use the textbooks of the country of origin in the language of the country of origin, so that, for example, in the camps, the education can continue, then that's something that can start sooner. If we want to switch to the curriculum and language of the host community, then we would have to go through the accreditation and language issues, and whether there is a hybrid way that we can use to make advantage of both. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there someone in our panel who would like to answer this question? Yes.
No, Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's usually very challenging, you know, when people flee, and we've talked about the extended period of protraction that we have, and given that, you know, the refugee situations are often not very temporary, it makes sense, and this is also what communities feel it's for people to follow the curriculum of the country of asylum, because the challenge is if you implement the curriculum of the country of origin, it's really hard to get access to the curriculum resources that you need, the assessments, the teachers, you know, training and all that. And we have seen in few situations where refugees follow the country of origin curriculum, it's extremely difficult. And sometimes there are also political sensitivities of refugees not being allowed by their countries of origin not to use so there are those challenges. So, but situations are of course different. And I will say it will be good to, you know, consult with the refugee community and take into account, you know, whether this is something that is temporary or not. Yeah, I don't know. This is what I will say on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jure. Is there any other comment or question? Yes? Oh, sorry. Okay. Over to you, Mohamed.
Oui. Moi, je pense que il y a les grands défis, les grands challenges, c'est d'abord la langue. Au Tchad, nous sommes des francophones. Mais nous recevons des réfugiés du Nigeria qui sont à l'origine des anglophones. Nous recevons également des réfugiés du Soudan qui sont des arabophones. Heureusement que le Tchad a deux langues de travail, le français et l'arabe. Donc, la question de l'intégration dans nos écoles ne se pose pas beaucoup pour ceux qui étudient en arabe et pour ceux qui étudient en français. Par contre, pour ceux qui viennent du Nigeria, dont la langue de travail est l'anglais, c'est un peu difficile pour qu'ils puissent s'adapter. Mais dès l'instant où, en accord avec le HCR, en accord avec les réfugiés eux-mêmes, que nous avons décidé qu'ils soient intégrés dans le curriculum du Tchad, que ce soit les enseignants ou que ce soit les réfugiés eux-mêmes, je crois que le problème a été réglé en grande partie. Même ceux qui sont venus du Nigeria, qui apprennent en français, ont une deuxième richesse, une deuxième langue de formation. En dehors de l'anglais, qui est une langue de base, ils ont appris également le français. Donc, c'est deux richesses, l'anglais et le français. Les réfugiés qui viennent du Nigeria, qu'ils soient des enseignants ou qu'ils soient des élèves, obtiennent donc cette deuxième richesse de l'apprentissage de la langue française. Je voulais ajouter en disant ceci. Les enseignants des réfugiés, mais peut-être que j'ouvre une parenthèse pour dire que l'autre challenge pour les enseignants des réfugiés, c'est qu'ils ont une situation, n'est-ce pas, un peu difficile avant d'intégrer le programme du Tchad, parce qu'ils ont en face d'eux soit leurs compatriotes, soit les gens du Tchad. Ils ont également en face d'eux des réfugiés. Mais l'avantage aussi, c'est qu'il n'y a pas de différence, il n'y a pas de discrimination entre les enseignants du Tchad et les enseignants réfugiés, tout comme il n'y a pas de discrimination entre les enfants réfugiés et les enfants tchadiens. C'est ça le plus important. Le plus important, c'est vraiment l'intégration. C'est l'intégration. Je ne sais pas en anglais comment ça se dit, mais l'intégration, ça permet aux enseignants réfugiés centrafricains, Babo l'a dit tout à l'heure, il est venu terminer ses études au Tchad, mais il a réussi également à s'inscrire comme enseignant dans une école, dans deux écoles privées. Ça veut dire qu'on n'a pas dit qu'il était centrafricain, non. On a dit simplement Babo, c'était un enseignant. Et donc, à ce titre, il a pu intégrer les écoles, n'est-ce pas? Donc, c'est ça cet avantage aussi de s'interpénétrer, mais surtout d'accepter que les réfugiés, que ce soit les enseignants ou que ce soit les professeurs intègrent facilement le curriculum. Et ça, c'est très important, n'est-ce pas, pour que demain, les réfugiés, quand ils repartent dans son pays, qu'ils puissent avoir donc la force, le tact nécessaire pour qu'ils puissent travailler dans son pays. Le Centrafricain qui a travaillé au Tchad, demain, Babo, il va repartir en RCA, il peut travailler chez lui. Quelqu'un d'autre également peut aller travailler chez lui sans problème.
So very briefly, the biggest challenge is language. In Chad, the teaching languages are Arabic and French, and so when they have received refugees from Nigeria, language has been the biggest challenge. But the good thing in the Chadian schools is that at the school level, the difference between children according to language is not a big issue. So children eventually learn. The teacher that you saw on the screen earlier did all of his education in Chad, got post-secondary degrees in Chad, now has a job in Chad. And when he is eventually able to go home, will take with him the qualifications and the education and the career path that will help him start again.
Thank you so much for your answer. Now we can go to our second question.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Al-Baili. I am from Educators Without Borders International Organization. It is based in Geneva, and we've been doing work in some emergency contexts. One of the challenging issues that facing most of the NGOs providing quality education in refugee camps is the teachers. I think you are addressing very important and crucial question and issue regarding the qualification of teachers. Do we need really qualified teacher, or anybody can serve as a teacher? Because teaching is a profession. We have to recognize that we need certain qualification to serve as a teacher. Without those certification, you will not be able to provide quality education and make the impact on students. Therefore, I think very important issue we have to address: what would be the minimum qualification needed for qualified teacher. Also, in terms of the career path for the teachers, Mohammed, you mentioned that you served as a teacher, but however, maybe you face some issues regarding what would be the eventual or the career path for teachers. Is there any clear career path for teachers working in refugee camps and serving, refugees and educate them? So I think we need some issues regarding, when we talk about transforming education, we need also to address the teaching in refugee camp and emergency situations.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone in our panel who would like to answer or add something else? On that case, we could continue with our next question. I'm so sorry, we will continue to Chris so he can do a short summary on the first discussion. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Adriana, and thank you to our panelists and responses from the audience. Excuse me. I think one of the real tensions here is our need to uphold the professional status of teachers and to really enhance the value of those qualifications that teachers hold so dear, and the extent to which teachers can travel, for lack of a better way of putting it, travel with those qualifications so that their capabilities, so that their knowledge, so that their skills as professionals can accompany them wherever they may find themselves needing to work. But within that tension, I think as well, we need to ask ourselves who we consider to be able to teach, to have access to the profession of teaching, because the latest data we had from 2016 showed that there was a teacher shortage of 69 million. I assume that number is far greater now. And that number for me represents an even larger number of children who are missing out on the adults in their lives, the teachers in their lives that can cause quality learning, safety, and well-being. So as much as we want to uphold, and I think this was shared by our audience and our panelists, as much as we want to uphold that status and value the profession, we also need to reconsider what some of those barriers to entry might be, and how, I think as you said, sir, what some of those minimum qualifications might be to allow more adults who are willing and able to teach to be in the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Now we go to our second question. How, if at all, do we recognize community and refugee teachers as part of the professional teacher workforce in refugee hosting settings? We'll hear from our teachers joining online.
The organization is offering trainings for teachers, and the training that we go through, I go through, is really hard to and I also do organize the teacher organization, especially when I'm always to find that when we use it around the system, we also go to third water in my community.
Now we will hear from our panelists. Our next panelist is Dean Brooks from INEE. Over to you, Dean.
Thank you, Adriana. Thank you, everybody here, esteemed guests and Secretary General. Loved hearing your comments. This question is a tough one and gave me a lot of reflection. And as I was thinking about it, then I looked at all of you and I was curious, how many of you are teachers or were teachers? Can I just see? Yeah, that's quite a few. Yeah. And I was thinking about how actually in all of our work, I was a teacher too for many years. Somehow I ended up in this job, but I still feel like I'm teaching sometimes. And then I actually went back to the classroom. So I did this work for about, working in development, humanitarian settings. And then I went back and taught a year. And wow, it's hard, as Mohammed was saying. And I taught in a little school, first graders. I had like 20 first graders and I was exhausted. And then I came back to this work. And I say that because I think our blog that we're publishing soon also doesn't capture an important point, is that in many of these settings, every setting I've worked, we lose teachers because our teachers are professionals, skilled, committed to their work, and those are the people we need when it comes to humanitarian response. And so we see the teaching profession move on. UNHCR, I think, stole Muhammad, didn't they? So, and that's the reality. But I think, and sir, you said a really important point. This is a profession. I'm proud to be a teacher. I still consider myself a teacher, and I hope someday to go back to the classroom. And I think we have a responsibility as a community to uphold the profession. And when we're thinking about responding in these contexts, how would you as a teacher want to be treated in that situation? So conditions of work, every context I've been as well, $60 a month sometimes is high. How do you feed your family? So of course you're going to take that other NGO job or the UN job. That's the reality. And our profession isn't maybe upholding enough. And that's why we need Education International to help us. Because you have how many thousands you said?
32 million.
32 million. Yeah. Okay, let's get them to help us support this work. Look at the amazing work UNHCR has done about inclusion, and Chad, what an amazing example of including refugee teachers in the system. How do we get that type of example out there to the world? And just to also say, we need UNESCO. UNESCO is the specialized arm of the UN for education. We need UNESCO to help us to map out the certification, the accreditation paths in all of these examples. And it's very important that we also think about do no harm. So we look at all of these different situations. I think of contexts where, okay, we will let teachers from another country, I won't go into which context, but we won't give them the same status. And then that creates a tiered system of who's higher than another, and it becomes these challenges like that. That's where we need the UN to help us in their specialization to actually map out that pathway. I actually, in my teaching career, wasn't certified. I used to teach deaf ed. I didn't have my certification, but in that US setting, I was able to get emergency certification because there was a pathway. How do we create those types of pathways? And they exist. I think the Sweden example is another example. Chad is an example. Uganda, actually, there's some examples. So let's learn from that. And then my last point, I think I've already gone over. Sorry, Adriana, but you gave me the microphone. So, but the other example is I think we can also learn from another UN agency who's been doing this for more than 50 years, and that's UNRWA. And UNRWA has an amazing education system in contexts where they have answered these questions around certification. So I think we can also turn to them to pull some great examples of how to deal with the certification, accreditation of refugee teachers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean. We will open our panel to the audience, but this time we would like to accept comments instead of questions. So if any of you would like to make a comment, please raise your hand. Yes?
Thanks very much. So I'm not sure if you can hear me. I'll put it right back on. But yes, I'm Stephanie Benson from IAEP UNESCO. And one of the, hi Dean. One of the issues I think that's important to focus on is this idea that in many ways we keep fixating on the problem of a global teacher shortage, and that we seem to think that the issue in these displacement contexts, these crisis contexts, is that we don't have sufficient numbers of qualified teachers. But the question, I think, is actually a much more complex one that everybody has been talking about today, which is the idea that it's not about a shortage in the sense of a fuel shortage or a food shortage, right? We're not suddenly going to find a mystery source of teachers that we can then bring in. The problem is that we have challenges with attracting people to the profession. We have challenges making sure that there are refugee teachers in waiting, you know, that there are people who have had a good quality basic education who then want to come into this profession. And then we have to think about what's actually happening in these settings. So many of these teachers, whether they're nationals or refugees, don't have a career path. it's like they've got into the profession and then they're still standing at the door, where every year they have to wait for that contract to be renewed. And of course, they're then going to go, you know, to a different profession. So I think there's something about this aspect of lifelong teaching that we need to think about, that we need to really change that question. So if somebody says to you, you know, we have a problem of a teacher shortage, we say, no, we have a problem with attracting passionate, qualified candidates. We have problems with not providing them with adequate support. And then we have problems with retaining them. And then we have problems actually rewarding them once that job is complete. We don't value them. We don't give them access to proper pensions and that. So I think it's about reframing that question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is really inspiring to hear from both of you, teachers, passionate about your work. Thank you so much. Now we go back to Chris.
I'll keep my reflection really brief because I think, yeah, Dean, you put things forward so clearly, and Stephanie, your comments were really welcome as well. And both of you, in fact, got me thinking about the fact I was once a teacher too, and only for 3 years, because the conditions within which I worked, you were not conducive to raising a family, to living a decent quality of life. And I come from New Zealand, where a quality of life is much easier to achieve than our colleagues working in refugee contexts. So Dean, when you asked, imagine ourselves in those classrooms as teachers, I mean, it's an overwhelming proposition really to consider. And so I think centering ourselves in that experience should compel all of us to really put the conditions in place within the power that each of us have in the organizations we work in to, yeah, I think, as you said, Stephanie, not address necessarily the teacher shortage, but to really address why these people in waiting are unable to access the classroom and do the work that they're so passionate about doing. So thank you both for those really insightful and inspiring comments.
Thank you so much, Chris. Now we are moving into our final question. What are the limitations or barriers of current financing mechanisms, and what innovative approaches exist to overcome financing challenges? We will hear again from our teachers first. Now I would like to pass the mic to Carlos Vargas Tames from Unesco for his intervention related to this question. Over to you, Carlos.
Gracias, Adriana. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, first of all, for this invitation. It is a pleasure to be sharing this panel and to be hearing and being part of this conversation with you all. Maybe a first reflection that comes to mind when we talk about the working conditions as we have, when we talk about the status, the protection of teachers in emergency and crisis situation, one of the first things that comes to mind is the recent COVID crisis. And the reason why it comes to mind is because in the past 2 years, many of the lessons that we learned, many of the strategies that we leveraged to support learning, to support the continuity on learning, we learned them from the field of education in emergencies. Everything that has to do with the flexibility of calendars, of schedules, of forms of provision, everything that has to do with the adaptability of the curriculum, not only in terms of time and place, but also in terms of the content that is vital, that is life-saving. Also, as to the difficulties of sustaining learning in, for example, overcrowded households, in precarity of conditions when it comes to connectivity or to electricity, issues and things around, for example, multi-grade, multi-level learning, integrating teaching, adapting, personalizing. These are some of the various strategies that we have been promoting and that we have been leveraging throughout the COVID crisis, particularly in times of school closures and disruptions. We learned them from the field of education in emergencies. So to me, it is only an exercise of justice now that we actually contribute and retribute to the field of education in emergencies for the many lessons that we have learned, with other lessons that we have learned in places and geographies where conflict is not intense and where conflict is not an everyday phenomenon. And these lessons I'm thinking about come from how different countries and how different geographies, again, are able to develop and to formulate policies for teachers. Policies that speak of these difficulties that we have been listening to. The recruitment, the deployment, the professionalization of teachers. This takes a whole different dimension when it comes to education in crisis and emergency situations. So the recruitment, we have heard the difficulties of attracting people to the profession. The retainment, it takes a whole different dimension. It is not only about retaining teachers in the profession, in the classroom, in a given territory, but actually to keep them alive. So these issues that we usually consider when we develop and we try to formulate teacher policies, again, around recruitment, around deployment, about the retainment of teachers, has to be considered in a different light, in a light of emergency. So with that in mind, when we think about and we embark in the formulation of the policy measures on the transformation of education systems that support teachers, we need to take these particular conditions and these particular peculiarities, excuse me, of education in emergencies into consideration. Now, that has implications in terms of investment. That has implications in terms of the flexibility, the mobility, the materials, the multi-format forms of provision that can be accessible, not only for teachers to teach, but actually for teachers to be professionalized and for teachers to contribute to, for example, the development of learning materials, as is usually the case. For example, to the lessons learned on what is the priority in terms of content, of curriculum, in terms of what pedagogies are best to use, taking into consideration, again, the differences of these particular contexts. So dimensions that we've seen and we've heard, for example, in terms of the affective dimension, the social, the psychosocial, the emotional, the post-trauma, and other elements are very important to take into consideration. And these don't come easy. This kind of pedagogies, this kind of forms and way of teaching and building and rebuilding communities is something that teachers do in refugee settings and that we don't take enough stock of for feeding into curricular changes, to feeding into pedagogies. So I think when it comes to teacher policies, we need to adapt the way we think about them. We need to prioritize certain dimensions. Let me just share with you a module that was developed by the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030, together with our colleagues from the IIEP, UNESCO's Institute for International Planning, and which draws on the 9 dimensions of the Teacher Policy Development Guide of UNESCO and the TTF, with a particular focus precisely on teacher recruitment, deployment, and retention, but also on initial and ongoing teacher education. One of the issues that is addressed in this particular module has to do with what has been mentioned now. It is basically around how do we recognize already, and how do we try to formalize, to certify, to accredit the knowledge that refugee teachers, for example, develop in practice. So this is something very important, not only for themselves, but actually something to be shared among communities of practice and among different settings. Now, these mechanisms for recognition, validation, and accreditation are only possible if we believe there is a specific qualification of teachers to work in crisis settings. So it is important to say that we also need to find what are some of those minimum standards that differentiate the teaching in a regular classroom from the teaching in a crisis-affected community. So those are some of the developments that need to happen in terms of initial and continuous professional development. And finally, around employment, working conditions, and well-being, I think it has been already underlined. It is very important that we mobilize new funds, new financing for improving the working conditions of refugee teachers there where they are, and particularly to secure, to guarantee the conditions of protection and security that is needed for them to continue to carry on their work. So let me just finalize by saying, in 2021, the Teacher Task Force also launched a campaign that you might remember for investing in teachers, investing more and investing better. So I believe we need to make another call for, in particular, the case of refugee teachers. How do we maintain or increase salaries? How do we improve working conditions? What are the particularities when it comes to personal and social security? How do we improve their continuous professional development and ensure their health and psychosocial and mental well-being? This, I believe, requires the mobilization of multiple stakeholders. UNESCO stands ready, certainly, to support in terms of the professionalization, the recognition, the validation, the accreditation of prior knowledge and experiential knowledge of teachers, but we need other partners. We need member states, we need international financial organizations to come in and fill the gap in terms of the working conditions that teachers in refugee settings present. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Now I will open the forum for questions and comments from our audience. Is there any of you who would like to participate? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Maxime. I'm the Deputy Perm Rep for the UK delegation to UNESCO, and I just wanted to pick up on Carlos's final point because I think you went very quickly on that one, and it's really interesting what you said about the salaries of teachers and the points about their social well-being and UNESCO's place in the discussion and it requiring multiple stakeholders, but UNESCO has a very special place. And I'm interested, actually, if you could tell us a bit more about what you think UNESCO's place really is in that multi-stakeholder conversation about the status of teachers, their conditions, improving their conditions, and possibly validating, providing a sort of a reassurance on, yes, that teacher is qualified. Please go ahead, it's fine. Kind of this conversation, I think. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Maxime, for the question. I don't want to be long because I could talk about many different initiatives, but let me begin with one important one, which can frame the work in terms not only of the financing, but also of the quality measures. As you know, UNESCO has a normative function as well. And together with the ILO, we are the custodians of the 1966 recommendation concerning the status of teachers. Now, this is a recommendation that has been adopted by most countries in the world. And it is a recommendation that outlines the rights of teachers, their responsibilities, issues around the working conditions. And this includes from remuneration to the social standing, to the participation of teachers in policy making, to other areas of working conditions that have to do, for example, with how intellectually rewarding the profession might be, speaking of attracting people to the profession, and how they can actually take part in educational decision making. So issues around social dialogue, but not only, issues around autonomy and agency and the such. So all of this framework to say, within the rights of teachers, which are contained in this recommendation, but also in other international human rights law instruments, and particularly I'm thinking here of the ILO conventions concerning decent work. I think we have a strong instruments to make a case, if it's not strong enough, probably a legal case, as to the rights that teachers have to certain working conditions. And these working conditions, again, change according to the context. So that is something that can be done, and that is something that can be leveraged. UNESCO, together with the ILO, also leads an expert committee, which is called the CERT, the Committee for Experts on the Application on the Recommendations Concerning the Teaching Profession, which is a committee that meets every 3 years and that looks at allegations that come from member states, from teacher unions, and from other sectors as to violations of the recommendation. So that is certainly another mechanism where things, complaints, allegations can actually be examined. And this committee makes recommendations to both the governing body of the ILO and the executive board of UNESCO so as to address different areas. So to me, that's a very concrete path of action to look into better working conditions based on the very normative instruments that we safeguard. Secondly, around quality, just to say very briefly, there are different standards that have been developed that are global. Education International and UNESCO released a global framework for teaching standards, which outlines a consensus, basically, the process of identifying what are the minimum skills, the minimum knowledge, the minimum, let's say, I like the way some countries call it deontology, which is an ethics, an ethos of the teacher. And these are certainly, again, context sensitive, and it can be made a case, for example, in case of teachers in crisis and emergencies, whether there are some specific knowledge, skills, codes of conduct and ethics that can be thought about. And this is very important because once we have a standard or a framework, this can be used to rethink, to revisit training from initial to continuous. It can be used for career pathways, for teacher progression. It can be used to look at, for example, the results of teaching. It can be used for a number of things that we're always promoting in terms of the rights and conditions of teachers. So this is something that can be done as well, and that actually we are doing, and also our colleagues in EI, by promoting the use of teaching standards. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for your question. We will accept one last comment or question. Is there anyone who would like to participate as well? Yes?
Yes, hello. My name is Noémie Robiati. I'm the Chief of Education, UNICEF Central African Republic. On est voisin avec le Tchad. Je suis la Centrafrique. Merci. Bonjour. Thank you very much for the panel. It's been very interesting. And I do realize that there is a wide variety of countries that are at this pre-summit. And of course, the Central African Republic, it is a country which is quite complex. We still have an ongoing conflict. And as our colleague from Chad has acknowledged, some of the refugees also, they're really spread out through all the different countries across. So my question to both actually the representative from Chad, which could, as well as UNESCO, maybe to share some of the best practices and experiences, as while we all agree on certain minimum standards and professionalization of the teaching profession. However, in Central African Republic, we find ourselves with nationally 67% is community teachers. We don't talk about refugee teachers per se, because we are actually mostly sending refugees abroad, but we have a lot of displaced, constant displacements, internally displaced people, including teachers, as well as because of the conditions of the country. The majority of teachers actually do not get deployed into the country because of the security situations. Therefore, we rely very much on community teachers. And in some of the regions, actually, it goes up to 80–90%, which is community teachers who obviously on the one hand are volunteers and therefore they're there. So it's at least they're doing something, but a lot of them have not even finished the schools themselves. So in terms of concrete and practical best practices, while at the same time, we are constantly in discussions with government and our minister who is here in the conference and all the other director generals, how do we balance, the community teachers who are there at the moment and who need a bit of strengthening in terms of financing. They're not part of the system, so they're not paid by the government, but they are the only resource in the communities, in the villages. They are the ones who are local and therefore do not run away, actually, just because this is where they come from. At the same time, so looking at the financing education in terms of that, as well as the teaching profession and how to strengthen the capacities and work with what we have. Because while at the very end, we have a whole curriculum reform and a whole standardization of teaching methodologies and the professionalizations, at the same time, at the moment, this is what the condition is. So I wanted to hear if there is any best practices, as well as some of maybe the role of UNESCO in terms of, some of this support in countries in crisis, such as the Central African Republic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone in our? Oh, okay.
Bien, mais peut-être que je reviendrai sur tout à l'heure en conclusion, parce que vers la fin, je interviendrai également pour dire un peu mon sentiment sur l'ensemble de la discussion qui a eu lieu. Vous savez, d'abord, il ne faut pas traiter les enseignants réfugiés comme étant différents des autres enseignants. Ils sont des enseignants comme les autres. Comme on peut le faire pour les agents de la santé, par exemple, des infirmiers. Ils sont des infirmiers tout court. Il ne faut donc pas les catégoriser en disant ce sont des enseignants réfugiés. Ça, on les stigmatise et on leur donne une étiquette, ce n'est pas bon. Deuxièmement, je crois qu'il faut accepter dans nos écoles normales d'instituteurs, dans les écoles, parce que l'enseignement est un métier. Ce n'est pas n'importe qui peut devenir enseignant. On devient enseignant parce qu'on le souhaite, parce qu'on le veut. Donc, il faut que dans nos écoles normales de formation, que les enseignants qui arrivent, qu'ils soient réfugiés ou non, qu'ils viennent par vocation. Ce n'est pas parce que vous avez cherché du travail ailleurs, vous n'en avez pas trouvé que vous devenez enseignant. Donc, c'est un sacerdoce, simplement parce que si vous finissez votre mission dans le pays d'accueil, vous repartez chez vous pour devenir enseignant. On ne devient pas enseignant par défaut. On devient enseignant parce qu'on veut être un enseignant. Maintenant, j'ai entendu tout à l'heure mon frère Babo au Tchad qui a parlé effectivement de la condition des enseignants. Il faut créer de bonnes conditions pour que les enseignants réfugiés, n'est-ce pas, puissent bénéficier des mêmes avantages que les enseignants nationaux. C'est-à-dire avoir un contrat en bonne et due forme pour que le salaire qui est versé aux nationaux le soit également pour les réfugiés. Mais alors, il faut au moins que l'enseignant réfugié, n'est-ce pas, obtienne nécessairement au-dessus du SMIC. Parce qu'il ne faut pas non plus considérer que l'enseignant réfugié étant dans le besoin, on lui donne n'importe quel salaire. Non. Je crois qu'il faut le considérer comme un enseignant comme les autres et obtenir également le salaire des autres. L'autre idée qui m'arrive à la tête, c'est qu'au niveau du ministère de l'Éducation nationale, nous devons normalement enregistrer tous les enseignants réfugiés dans notre base de données. Parce que là, ils sont chacun dans son coin, ils sont dispersés, mais nous devons avoir une base de données en bonne et due forme pour qu'on sache combien d'enseignants réfugiés nous avons chez nous, quel est leur grade, quel est leur niveau, quel est leur diplôme, et surtout obtenir une certification. Par exemple, un diplôme obtenu au Cameroun, obtenu au Niger, au Nigeria, en RCA, doit être le même que le diplôme du Tchad. Une licence, c'est une licence, un baccalauréat, c'est un baccalauréat, un master, et ainsi de suite. Donc, ce qu'il faut faire, c'est vraiment de faire une équivalence de diplôme et de considérer que les diplômes obtenus ici ou là doivent être le même. Et enfin, peut-être, avant que je ne revienne à la conclusion, enfin, peut-être, il faut qu'on partage, n'est-ce pas, nos expériences, parce que d'autres pays également implémentent les mêmes choses. Par exemple, aller en Ouganda, aller, je ne sais pas, au Kenya, pour voir un peu ce qui se passe, comment les enseignants sont traités, comment ils sont considérés, pour que les bonnes pratiques qui se déroulent ailleurs puissent être également dupliquées chez nous. Voilà, c'est ce que je voulais ajouter un peu avant de venir à la conclusion.
What the Secretary General has said is that in the case of refugee teachers, it's really important not to stigmatize them with the label of refugee teacher. They're teacher first and foremost. And consequently, their salary scales and their training and everything associated with their status as a teacher or a pre-service teacher should be embraced by the country, the host country. They should be allowed to go to teacher training schools and to receive certification within those contexts.
Thank you so much. Now we will go back to Chris.
If I can.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Very briefly to just share a couple of ideas, and also draw in on what the Secretary General was mentioning as well. There is an issue in terms of formal education, in terms of formal teacher education for practitioners and for teachers, either volunteer community teachers. And I believe there are right now a couple of opportunities, for example, in terms of what the Secretary General mentioned, teacher training institutions and degrees. The possibility of mobility, which is something that is enabled by the recognition of diplomas, the mutual recognition of degrees. That is something that happens at higher education level. As you know, in Barcelona a month ago, the convention, the Global Convention on the Recognition of Higher Education Degrees was also adopted. Now, the problem with some normal schools and some teacher training institutions is that they might not confer a higher education degree. So it varies from place to place. The entry requirement into the profession might not be a higher education diploma. So just to say that in those cases, again, it is important to count on mechanisms for certification. And there are ways of doing that. And the question was about good examples as well into the recognition, validation, and accreditation of previous learning. So I can mention two in particular within the same continent, which are in Madagascar and in Senegal. So there are mechanisms for the recognition and the validation of the pedagogical knowledge and the practice of teachers that have been practicing for a long time, and to try and get the certification, the qualification of a teacher, which is equivalent to a higher education degree. And in other countries, this process of certification, which goes into the path of careers, is actually coupled with financial incentives. And I'm thinking particularly of the case of Indonesia, where community teachers are being professionalized, are being certified, and are being transferred into civil service. So that's to say, they are becoming fully fledged teachers with not only the qualification, but actually the salaries and this is in public education, of course, that can continue to professionalize themselves. So just to mention these two possibilities, recognition, validation, and accreditation, combined with careers, and as was mentioned before, equivalent remuneration to those of regular teachers. And secondly, the recognition of higher education degrees and the mobility that this enables of teachers across borders.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Now we go back to Chris.
Cool, thank you so much, Adriana, and thank you to Carlos and the great questions from the floor as well. Just in my brief reflection to summarize that last provocation before I hand over to Charlotte, I first want to recognize the contribution of our teachers in Chad and Kenya today. And just as I listened to Miss Johanna, it really made me disappointed, aggrieved that she is not in the room with us today, because I think her observations and the way she sort of organized the priorities in terms of financing, in terms of the interventions that would improve her quality of work, are as powerful as any of our own contributions. And teachers like her should be a more direct part of this conversation. And that was a point also brought up in the plenary yesterday by the Minister of Education from Senegal, David Moinina Singé, who actually related that teachers he was bringing from Sierra Leone were stopped at the border because they weren't considered to have sufficient qualification, sufficient authority to be participating in a forum like this. And so I think, as you said, Carlos, it's about bundling a lot of these issues together, whether it's status, recognition, mechanisms that can better appropriate better pay, All of these things come together, and I just want to acknowledge the contribution of our teachers and reflect on the fact that they should be with us here today. I think it was also a really important point that a lot of our response to COVID-19, not just in education, but also in public health and other sectors, were inspired by the work that teachers have been doing for many, many years. And I want to acknowledge that much of that work was not necessarily the product of professional development or the product of policy. It was the product of teachers' own capabilities as creative, innovative professionals working in their communities. And so the sooner and the better we can put mechanisms in place that formalize those skills and provide compensation and recognition of those skills, the better. And I think as well as our teachers have reflected on, as well as our panelists, teachers, unfortunately, despite the fact that we call for professionalization, that we celebrate teachers, that we champion teachers, they must contend with this contradiction that all of that does not mean much when they cannot provide for their families, when they cannot sustain a quality of life, nor access a career path which gives them a view to the future. So I think we also need to address how we celebrate and champion teachers, and the fact that we've got a moral duty to celebrate teachers through better incentives and better conditions. And I just want to finish with a personal pitch on behalf of INEE, and particularly the Teachers in Crisis Context Collaborative. Hopefully next week, inshallah, there will be a publication coming out called Teachers in Crisis Context, Promising Practices in Teacher Management, Professional Development, Wellbeing, and School Leadership. It's actually 2 publications because it became quite large. And we've got 42 new case studies looking at examples from the field, promising practices that look at how do we better support teachers across all those different factors. And there's one case study in particular which comes to mind, which is from Myanmar. And again, it's looking at the issue of community teachers, and particularly the professionalization of community teachers, and how the community, through the coordination of civil society organizations, how the community rallied together to provide better pay for teachers in lieu of insufficient or inadequate government pay. And there's a lot of teacher voice in that case study that talks about the impact of that community movement and what that better pay meant for them and how they saw themselves as teachers. But not only that, because of that initiative in Myanmar, more people lined up to become teachers, and there's now huge demand and huge respect for being teachers in that community. So do look out for that publication coming out next week, we hope. But on that note, thank you to everyone, and over to you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Chris. I think Adriana will introduce the closing statements. Thanks a lot.
Yes, I will be introducing closing statements. I would like to remind every panelist to stay at 2 minutes per panelist. So we will hear first from Mr. Mohamed Said Farah.
Merci pour l'occasion que vous nous offrez pour parler un peu de nos pays et de la situation des réfugiés que nous recevons, mais aussi des enseignants réfugiés. Nous sommes en train d'aller vers le sommet mondial de septembre à New York. Je crois que c'est l'objectif, c'est d'arriver avec des idées novatrices, des idées nouvelles pour permettre une prise en charge définitive et meilleure des enseignants. Je crois que c'est ça l'objectif principal de notre mission. Et on est arrivé aujourd'hui à la bonne compréhension selon laquelle on a affaire à des enseignants réfugiés, mais surtout on a affaire à des enseignants tout court, qu'il faut donc bien encadrer, qu'il faut aider à s'installer, qu'il faut aider à se former, qu'il faut aider à avoir, n'est-ce pas, un bon renforcement des capacités, mais surtout aussi que nos pays les considèrent comme des enseignants comme les autres. Et ça, c'est le plus important, c'est-à-dire de les recevoir dans nos écoles de formation, de les mettre dans nos écoles pour qu'ils soient enseignants, de les évaluer, de renforcer leurs capacités, de leur donner toutes les possibilités d'abord de s'intégrer, mais aussi demain, nous le souhaitons tous pour eux, que lorsqu'ils regagnent leur pays, eh bien, ils regagnent leur pays et qu'ils soient capables d'être de bons agents de développement. Merci.
First, thanking the panel and the conveners for the opportunity to present the situation in Chad and the situation of refugees and refugee teachers. the Secretary General implores us to convene at the summit to help establish kind of a global position that refugees need to be embraced by their host countries, that refugee teachers can be trained, can be engaged, can take forward all their skills that they are able to acquire in a host country setting back home when they return so that they can help rebuild their countries. And that he hopes that one of the results of the summit is that there will be some kind of consensus on that, that we can bring that idea forward.
Thank you so much. Now we go back to Antonia Wolf.
Thanks so much. So I think if we're serious about the right to decent work, the right to education, the right of every student, every child to have a qualified teacher, we need to look at, or we need to make sure that the innovation is not taking place there, somehow compromising on rights, on things that we would take for granted in other parts of the world, and rather look at innovation as something in relation to these career pathways, in relation to who we work with. What innovative ways can we put in place to work with the teaching profession, work with the teachers wherever they are, whether it's a refugee camp, whether it is in a new host country, take advantage of the union as an ally, one that can provide some of that support, some of that community of practice, and a strategic partner as well as we work to identify career pathways that make sense in that local context and can get us towards that goal of ensuring that those who want to teach, and we need more of those, can access the qualifications, can access decent working conditions, have a salary that is paid regularly on time and that they can actually survive on, and that there isn't a parallel system where we have refugee teachers. And I think the Secretary General put this very well. We cannot have a two-tier system where some are seen as better people as others, just because of whatever status they may once upon a time have. And a final word about salaries. We are currently putting together an expert group to help us think through the issue of salaries, because there are too many teachers that are not paid. And we've seen examples over the past couple of years, Yemen, Lebanon, Afghanistan, where this goes on for months. So putting together an expert group to help us think through some of the possible innovative solutions, both looking at funding options and delivery methods. So happy to discuss that further with anyone interested here. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Now we go back to Dean Brooks.
Thank you again. Just to go back, so a couple of points. I believe, I mean, if we're going to be truly transformative at the Transformation Summit, then it really requires all of us to work together. We have to collaborate, we have to partner if we are going to be transformational. And I think a big part of that is to recognize the incredible investment that teachers represent. And so teachers are that key investment in supporting them with all the rights and conditions, as you said, and to flag how important that is. An initiative INE has started with the Alliance for Child Protection is looking at how child protection as a sector and education can come together and how we can have an integrated approach. And we have to recognize that teachers are critical to the protection of children and youth in the schools. And our sectors have to work together. And I would say other sectors as well. We've got to work with water and sanitation and health. And the COVID has taught us that we've got so much more work together that has to happen. So time to move out of our silos and actually collectively come together. And this is actually now the time. And I think we're hearing that, and we're hearing great examples from the minister from Chad, from other contexts where there's no reason to have a different status. Integrate the teachers into your schools and your schools will be better. So leaving you with that, but I also just want to encourage you. I mean, INEE, it's not a plug actually. INEE is your network. It was created with UNESCO, with UNHCR, with UNICEF 22 years ago. It was folks like you in the room who said, we need to collaborate. We need to work together. Let's create INEE. I joined back then. That tells you how old I am. And I was working in Guinea, and it's like, yes, we need a network. So if you're not a member of INEE, then you should be, because it's your network and it's for everyone here. So the many tools, the many resources we're talking about on the panel, they should be available on our website. And if they're not, then we need to talk because this is your network. So yes, thank you for today's conversation. Thank you to the incredible teachers who, I agree, I wish they were in the room with us. It saddens me that they couldn't be, or the resources weren't there to bring them here, but their voices are actually the most important today.
Thank you so much, Dean. Then we go back to Carlos Vargas.
Thank you very much. Just to keep brief, I just would like to emphasize what my colleagues in the panel have mentioned. I think it is important that as we move on to the summit in September, and as we identify what are some of the key levers for transformation, we make a point of how they apply to this particular education sector. And in that, I would say, and coming back to one of the comments from our colleague from UNICEF, from Central African Republic, is the good practices, the examples, the analysis of what are some of the changes, the policy changes, what are some of the professional development strategies that have worked in different geographies, an analysis of why they have worked and for whom and under what conditions, is something that will help us substantiate the policy messages, the commitments that we want heads of state and government to make in New York in October. So this is also an invitation to say this action track 3 is still open, and it will continue to be from here until September. So we are eager and avid to receive good practices. There's mechanisms for that in the website of the Transforming Education Summit. The more we get on this particular issue of refugee teachers and teachers in crisis contexts, the more visible we can make them, the more we can substantiate our specific recommendations. So that's an open invitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, Charlotte.
Thanks, Adriana. And thanks, Carlos. And I think really agree with you, Carlos. And as we'll prepare for the summit in New York, I would like to acknowledge that we cannot talk about education without talking about teachers. And we cannot talk about refugee education and refugee education policies without talking about refugee teachers and their contribution to refugee education. The discussion we've just had has highlighted that we need to be truly transformative in the way we consider, recognize, and support refugee teachers as the professionals that they are. We have talked about the difficult working condition of teachers in refugee hosting areas, yet we have reiterated that they are the most important factor that refugee children rely on to learn, thrive, and grow in their daily life. Refugee teachers deserve to be recognized for this. They deserve support, and they deserve to be heard and listened to. And for this to happen, we need to make refugee teachers visible in national planning around working condition and pay, retention and recognition, professional development and certification, as we mentioned before. We need to ensure that national teacher policies are inclusive of refugee teachers, just as we need refugee children to be included in all national education plans and budgets. And to be fully considered and heard, refugee teachers must also be systematically included in national social dialogue at the most local level. I'll finish by saying that funding is indeed the cornerstone of a truly transformative approach. The only way to fully and really support refugee teachers and encourage them to consider teaching as a real professional pathway is to ensure predictable, multi-year funding that does not rely solely on humanitarian actors. Countries hosting refugees, almost always low or middle-income countries, have shown great solidarity, as we've seen with Chad and many other countries across the world, but they also need support. They also need our support in the spirit of responsibility sharing that was agreed in the Global Compact on Refugees. And if we really want to leave no one behind, not to leave no one behind, we cannot ignore refugee learners and refugee teachers. Refugee teachers can help reduce the global teacher shortage. They want to help and contribute, and supporting them doing that in good condition, that would be the real transformative change for all learners. Thank you.
So to bring this side meeting to a close, first I want to thank Adriana for your expert moderation today. It was wonderful to have you here with us. Thank you to Charlotte for your closing and really compelling comments. And of course, thank you to all of our panelists, including our teachers, for your contribution today. It has been really insightful and everything we expected when we put this meeting together. I also want to thank all of you here present with us today for being part of this conversation and continuing to work for better conditions for refugee teachers. And I want to thank everyone who has joined us online through the webcast. I hope this meeting has provided you much food for thought and energy to go forward with this important work too. So on that note, thank you and safe travels.